The famous portrait of Queen Victoria in London's National Portrait Gallery is a triumph of imperial storytelling. It depicts a woman radiating authority and moral strength, wrapped in heavy silks and holding the scepter of a supposedly benevolent empire. She is presented as the grandmother of Europe, the embodiment of a civilization convinced it was carrying enlightenment into the darkest corners of the world. It is an image carefully designed to command reverence. Yet, if the painted surface were stripped away and replaced with government financial records from the year 1839, a far harsher truth would appear. What emerges is not the accounting of a refined monarchy. Instead, the ledgers resemble those of an organized criminal enterprise. Beneath the polished language of Victorian virtue, the British Empire in the mid-19th century was operating the largest and most sophisticated drug trafficking network in human history. The image of British warships bombarding the Chinese coastline to protect fleets of narcotics smugglers has been quietly erased from Western memory. It is absent from elite classrooms and sentimental portrayals of royal life. For Britain, this episode is often treated as an embarrassing lapse in judgment. For China, it represents the violent violation of an ancient civilization. But for the men seated in the boardrooms of the East India Company, the decision was not driven by cruelty. It was driven by necessity. The machinery of empire required constant cash, and by the 1830s that machinery was close to stalling. To understand the moral collapse of the British state, one must confront the ruthless economics of tea. By the 19th century, Britain's dependence on tea bordered on obsession. Tea fueled the Industrial Revolution, sustained 14-hour shifts in the mills of Manchester, bound the aristocracy together, and generated the tax revenue that paid for warships and civil servants. But the system was fatally flawed. Tea could only be grown in China, and the Qing Emperor in Beijing had no interest in British goods, leaving the empire facing a crisis it could not solve honestly. The Qing Emperor left no room for negotiation. For British merchants desperate for tea, there was only one acceptable form of payment, and that payment was silver. For decades, the British Empire watched its wealth flow eastward. Ships loaded with millions of ounces of silver sailed from London to Canton and returned carrying nothing but crates of dried tea leaves. This imbalance became a financial wound that threatened the stability of the empire itself. Silver reserves drained away, the currency weakened, and the Bank of England stood under growing strain. Inside the East India Company, executives examined their ledgers and reached a grim conclusion. If the silver was not recovered, the empire would eventually collapse under the weight of its debts. They needed a product the Chinese market could not resist, something that bypassed reason and exploited human biology. That product was opium. Its production was not left to criminals operating in shadows. It was organized with the cold efficiency of a state bureaucracy across the fertile lands of British-controlled Bengal. Indian farmers were forced to destroy food crops and replace them with vast fields of poppies. In processing centers like Patna and Gazipur, opium was manufactured on an industrial scale. Witnesses described enormous halls filled with earthen jars stacked to the ceiling, each packed with thick black paste, and a suffocating sweetness that poisoned the air for miles. Laborers stood waist-deep in the substance, stirring it in massive vats to ensure uniform strength. The methods of the Industrial Revolution had been applied directly to narcotics production. Each opium cake was stamped with the seal of the East India Company. It was a state-made commodity, but because opium was illegal in China, Britain hid behind deniability, selling the drug at auctions in Kolkata and letting private merchants become the smugglers. They were the couriers of the trade, men like William Jardine, a Scottish doctor who reinvented himself as a merchant, brilliant in intellect and entirely unburdened by moral restraint. Jardine and his partners purchased state-produced opium, loaded it onto fast clipper ships armed with cannons, and sailed toward the Pearl River Delta. Just offshore, near the isolated island of Linton, they anchored their ships and turned them into floating warehouses. From there, they bribed officials, armed local gangs, and built a distribution network that injected poison directly into Chinese society. Silver flowed back in massive quantities. The strategy worked perfectly. The silver once paid for tea returned to British hands and was deposited back into imperial banks. The trade imbalance vanished, and the British Empire stabilized itself financially. But the cost was the slow, systematic destruction of China. By 1838, British merchants were smuggling 40,000 chests of opium into China each year, amounting to roughly 5 million pounds of narcotic paste. Chinese officials reported villages where men no longer worked, lying unconscious on wooden platforms, while soldiers sold their weapons to sustain their addiction. The bureaucracy collapsed as magistrates themselves became intoxicated. Silver drained from the economy, triggering inflation, poverty, famine, and unrest. Emperor Daoguang watched his empire unravel not through invasion, but through addiction. Recognizing an existential threat, he appointed Lin Zexu, a rare official untouched by corruption, as imperial commissioner. Known as Blue Sky Lin for his integrity, Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839 with absolute authority. He dismantled the cartel without compromise, arresting dealers and forcing addicts into brutal rehabilitation, offering only two choices: abandon opium or die. Lin Zexu understood that punishing the victims would never end the crisis. To stop the poison, he had to sever the head of the snake. That meant confronting the British directly. He issued a blunt ultimatum to the foreign merchants living inside the wealthy enclave known as the 13 Factories. They were ordered to surrender all opium in their possession and swear never to traffic the drug again. When the merchants tried to delay, Lin revealed the resolve of a sovereign state pushed beyond endurance. Troops surrounded the foreign quarter. Barricades sealed the streets. Food and water were cut off. Drums and gongs echoed through the night, depriving the merchants of sleep. The lavish trading hub was transformed into a cage, and pressure mounted by the hour. Trapped inside, the British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, accepted defeat. Fearing for the lives of his countrymen, he ordered the surrender of the opium and promised that Britain, even the Queen herself, would compensate the losses. Lin Zexu seized more than 20,000 chests of opium, a mountain of narcotics worth millions and capable of drugging China for months, but he refused to sell it or recycle it. Instead, he ordered 3 vast trenches dug along the shoreline at Human. The opium cakes were smashed, dumped inside, and mixed with lime, salt, and water until the pits boiled and hissed. When the tide fell, the sluice gates were opened and the poison was flushed into the sea. The destruction continued for 23 days until nothing remained but toxic sludge. During this time, Lin Zexu sat in his tent composing a letter to Queen Victoria, a document that would become a moral epitaph of the 19th century. He wrote as a man of conscience, not as a barbarian to a civilized ruler. He asked a question that still echoes today. If opium was forbidden in her own country, how could it be allowed to poison others? He appealed to her humanity, believing she did not know what was being done in her name. Lin Zexu believed that if the Queen of England understood what was truly happening, she would intervene. But his letter was never answered, and there is no certainty that Queen Victoria ever read it. It likely vanished into a forgotten drawer inside the Foreign Office. And even if it had been read, it is doubtful it would have changed the course of history. In London, the destruction of the opium was not seen as justice. It was seen as theft, an unforgivable seizure of British property. When the news reached the City of London, those responsible did not feel shame. They prepared retaliation. William Jardine, the most notorious of the smugglers, traveled to London and launched a lobbying campaign of extraordinary intensity. He secured meetings with the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. Jardine laid maps across the table, tracing the Chinese coastline and marking deep-water ports and vulnerable cities. He claimed Britain's honor had been violated and that the destruction of opium was an attack on free trade. He assured the government that China's defenses were weak, relying on bows, arrows, and obsolete firearms. A small modern fleet, he argued, could crush the Celestial Empire in weeks. Britain faced a stark choice. The state was financially strained, dependent on tea taxes and silver, and now confronted demands of $20 million from its own merchants. It could accept the loss, or it could wage war. Britain chose war. In the summer of 1840, a fleet sailed from India toward China, carrying more than soldiers and cannons. It carried the Industrial Revolution itself. Leading the armada was the Nemesis, the first iron warship capable of crossing the open ocean. Powered by steam, it could move against the wind and navigate shallow rivers beyond the reach of traditional ships. Against China's wooden junks and antiquated cannons, the encounter was not a battle, but an execution. Britain tightened its grip and slowly strangled the empire into submission. British warships advanced methodically along the Chinese coastline, bombarding coastal forts and seizing strategic ports. They intercepted the tax barges carrying grain toward Beijing, placing the imperial capital itself under the threat of starvation. Chinese generals were disciplined and courageous men who had devoted their lives to warfare, yet they faced an enemy beyond their comprehension. Their cannon fire bounced uselessly off the iron hull of the Nemesis. Wooden Chinese vessels were set ablaze by Congreve rockets that screamed through the sky like mythical creatures. British officers later recorded the slaughter with a mix of astonishment and sorrow. They described Chinese soldiers standing their ground under storms of grape shot, firing matchlock muskets until they were cut down where they stood. This was not simply a battle, it was the collision of a medieval world with a modern one, and the modern world showed no mercy. As British forces pushed north, leaving burned cities and shattered bodies behind them, the emperor in Beijing was paralyzed by disbelief. He could not grasp how a small island nation had dismantled the defenses of the Middle Kingdom so easily. By the summer of 1842, British ships sailed up the Yangtze River and aimed their guns at the ancient city of Nanjing. The message was unmistakable: surrender or destruction. Faced with annihilation, the emperor yielded. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded the HMS Cornwallis and signed the Treaty of Nanking, remembered as the first of the unequal treaties. The terms were humiliating. China was forced to pay 21 million silver dollars, including 6 million to compensate Britain for the opium destroyed by Lin Zexu. The treaty opened Chinese ports to foreign control and compelled the permanent surrender of a barren island to Britain. That island was Hong Kong. Lord Palmerston dismissed Hong Kong as a barren rock, a bleak island without a single proper house. He wanted fertile land and productive cities, not a remote outpost inhabited by fishermen and pirates. The smugglers understood its value immediately. Hong Kong was the ultimate prize, a sanctuary where opium traders could anchor their ships and build warehouses under the protection of the Union Jack. The island quickly became the cartel's command center, the logistical heart through which poison flowed steadily into the Chinese mainland. After the treaty, the opium trade did not merely resume, it exploded. British administrators in India sharply increased production to feed the addiction of a shattered China. By the 1880s, Britain was selling more than 6,000 tons of opium to China each year. The profits underwrote the British Raj, funding railways, bureaucracy, and the navy that ruled the seas. The celebrated Pax Britannica was built on this foundation. Its peace and prosperity were financed by the addiction of millions of Chinese peasants. The psychological damage to China cut even deeper than the economic loss. The Opium War shattered a worldview formed over millennia, the belief that China stood at the center of civilization. From this trauma emerged the century of humiliation, an era of foreign domination and internal chaos that lasted into the mid-20th century and remains a defining scar of modern China. When Chinese leaders today speak of national revival or warn against outside interference, they are recalling human smoking pits and the flames that consumed the Summer Palace. The architects of the trade, however, prospered. William Jardine returned to Britain honored entered Parliament, and his firm evolved into a global powerhouse, shaping modern Hong Kong rather than answering for the suffering it caused. If you walk through Hong Kong's financial district today, the legacy of the drug trade is etched directly into the skyline. Jardine House still rises above the harbor, its circular windows facing waters once crowded with opium clippers. Streets continue to bear the names of smugglers. The dazzling wealth of one of the world's great financial centers rests on foundations laid by a cartel. There is a bitter irony at the heart of the Opium War's legacy. In time, the British Empire did turn against the opium trade. By the early 20th century, moral campaigns forced the government to end exports. But this shift was not born of conscience. It came because the empire no longer needed opium. New sources of profit had been found, and the damage was already irreversible. The concrete at Human stands today as a memorial to the betrayal of an ally. Yet, the skyline of Hong Kong stands as a far greater monument to the betrayal of an entire civilization. The Opium War reveals a brutal truth. The line between a lawful state and a criminal organization is often decided by who commands the larger navy. It shows how free trade, while framed as a noble principle, can be weaponized into a system of exploitation. The story of the Queen's cartel is a warning. We prefer to imagine history as steady moral progress, but the 19th century reminds us that progress is often financed by unseen suffering. Queen Victoria ruled for 63 years, celebrated as a symbol of dignity and virtue. Yet the jewels of her crown were polished with silver drained from a collapsing empire, and the tea in her cup was brewed from misery. The ghosts of the opium dens have not vanished. They live on in the distrust between East and West, reminding us that sovereignty is fragile, and that a nation poisoned can never fully trust the hand that later offers a cure.